Give me a sign when I start playing.
Okay. And we are here with a beautiful salon of very, very special guests. I will tell you later. I think that's better. I'm so excited, Jeremy, to have you here today.
That's so great. Yeah.
All in Bodrum. And I hope you recover soon. Thank you for joining despite your accident. Get well soon. He broke his
Thank you.
arm. And we are happy to start the session. Rudy, please introduce Jeremy and let's start. And in the end, we will have a Q&A. Jeremy, I will ask you our questions.
Great.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Janai, and hello, everyone over there. I know you see me, but I don't see you, but I'm here with all my heart, with all my love, and I'm with you, and I know that you had some amazing transformational days there. So Jeremy Lent is a really, really interesting guy if you don't know him. He was personally recommended to us a couple of years ago by Douglas Rushkoff when he released his book, The Web of Meaning, which is definitely a book that you should read if you haven't yet. So Jeremy was described by the Guardian journalist George Monbiot as one of the greatest thinkers of our age, and I totally agree with that. So he's going to do a talk on envisioning an ecological civilization, portraying a vision of a possible future of sustainable flourishing, changing the foundation of our civilization from one that is well-based to one that is life-based. Yeah, so he's an author. He's also a speaker. You can find many of his works at jeremylent.com. His work is basically investigating the underlying causes of our civilization's existential crisis, and he explores the pathways towards a life-affirming future. His award-winning books, The Pattern and Instinct and The Web of Meaning, trace the historical underpinnings and flaws of the dominant worldview and offer a foundation for an integrative worldview that could lead humanity to a flourishing future. So Jeremy is totally in our thinking. He's totally in our, with our sense of being and how we envision the world. So he's one of us. And I really hope that you can have a good session with him. He's going to have a session of half an hour and then with some questions. So Jeremy, it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for that great introduction, Rudy. Really appreciate it. And by the way, just if anyone's wondering about this sling, I actually broke my scapula doing a workout the other day, but I'm glad to say I'm in a healing path, so no worries. Well, so glad to be sharing these ideas with you today. And I understand that you've been going through days of really like incredible internal regeneration and transformation. And what I'd like to offer you today is this kind of vision of what's possible if we were to take that transformed set of values that you've been exploring the last few days and apply that to our entire civilization. And so to do that, I'm going to share the screen first, and we'll go through a slideshow. And then, as Rudy said, hopefully we'll have time for a brief Q&A at the end. And so it's titled Envisioning an Ecological Civilization. And I was talking about transforming our entire world. And so I'd like to actually begin with a view of our entire world. In fact, our Earth, our only home, really like the big picture. And here, this tiny, beautiful little planet, the only place we know of in the universe where life exists. And it actually emerged quite early on in the lifetime of this beautiful planet Earth, billions of years ago, about 4 billion years ago. And it took a long time to get to the complexity and diversity that we know today. And just the last flicker of time, like if the Earth was a full day, it'd be just the last second or so, a particular species emerged on this planet, which had the power, developed the power cumulatively to affect the entire planet itself. And of course, that is our human species. And we might ask, well, how have we done in this and wielding this incredible power? And the awful news, and I don't need to be telling any of you, is that we're doing a terrible job. We're all only too aware of these kind of harbingers of really like a daunting future Everywhere we look around the world now, wildfires, floods, droughts. And everyone here, of course, knows that these are the impact of the climate emergency we're facing. You're probably familiar with a chart that looks something like this, like looking at our greenhouse gas emissions, and we'd need to do these drastic cuts to just limit the heating this century to just 2 degrees, which scientists call a prescription for disaster. But at the moment, we're on a path for more like a catastrophic 3 degrees or more of climate heating. And that's because we're hitting these cascading, amplifying feedback zones in different parts of the Earth. But here's the thing. Terrible and terrifying as the climate emergency already is, it's just a symptom of something even bigger, which is the vast ecological destruction that we are causing on this beautiful living Earth across the board. Things like there has been a 69% decline in animal populations worldwide on average around the world just since 1970 alone, just the last 50 or so years. We're looking right now as a result of that and other things at the 6th great extinction of species since life began on Earth billions of years ago. This is the first one, of course, caused by the actions of one species, ourselves. This century, scientists are very clear. We're looking at the annihilation of coral reefs worldwide because of acidification and global heating on the oceans. And the UN reports that 95% of Earth's land will be degraded by 2050. But of all these statistics, the one actually that blows me away the most is this one. By 2050, at the current rate, there will be more plastic in the ocean by weight than fish. Now, we might ask ourselves, how did we ever get to this crazy situation? And I looked at that a number of years ago in a book that I wrote called The Patterning Instinct, which is like a history book of a cultural history of humanity's search for meaning all the way from when we were hunter-gatherers to the present day. And one thing came out of that book, the one sort of essence that I think is true for looking at history overall, which is that culture shapes values, and those values shape history. And by the same token, it's today's values that will shape the future. So we might ask then, well, what are our values? And I think, to me, this kind of picture encapsulates really what our values are today. Our dominant values are based on separation. All these people separate from each other, separate from even the food they're eating, connected with the technology that's manipulating their minds and their consciousness. And if we drill one level deeper, and we look at that modern story of separation, basically implicitly almost everything we hear about, talk about in our culture, and here in our social media are things like this, that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature, that humans are essentially selfish and competitive, that human progress arises basically from the conquest of nature, that the earth is really just nothing but a resource to exploit for human benefit. And that as a result of all this, the purpose of life ultimately is just to get wealthy and powerful. And now this way of looking at the world seems like it's just totally the only way there is, in many ways, in the dominant culture, no matter where we are in the world. But it was actually a very unique worldview that just emerged in early modern Europe, just a few hundred years ago, really for the first time in all human cultures around the world. And it was really kind of best summarized by this guy, Francis Bacon, who is considered to be the prophet of the scientific age back in like the 17th century. And he wrote about how this kind of clarion call to the modern world, how we can establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe and render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. This was what got people so inspired, so excited. And the Europeans took this message very seriously. They believed that not just they should have the power to conquer nature, but they also took this sense of conquest to believe they had some sort of God-given right and power to then conquer other continents as well. And so that led to really what we can understand as a worldview of a kind of extraction and exploitation, beginning from that worldview of separation in Europe hundreds of years ago. And from that worldview of separation, it got to be natural to see other people as resources and to see nature as a resource. And that led to these kind of two dimensions of supremacy, a sense of white supremacy, where Europeans began to view their own whiteness as giving them some sort of God-given supremacy over all other people. And also along with it, a sense of human supremacy, a sense that humans had some right to do whatever they wanted to the rest of the earth. And that led to this culture, these values of extraction and exploitation, which over hundreds of years has led now to our modern dominant system of global capitalism. So we're now in a situation where when we look around the world, 69 of the world's 100 largest economies are not nation states, not countries, but transnational corporations that basically own and dominate the world. And this system of global capitalism is one that's based on perpetual growth. Companies only have value, not based on what they're doing now, but based on what investors think they're going to do over the next 10 to 20 years. It's basically a system designed to mint billionaires. And it does that obviously very well, to the extent that we're now experiencing the greatest inequality in all of history, where the wealthiest couple of dozen billionaires own as much wealth as half of the entire world's population. And it's a system that has done really an excellently successful job of consuming the earth, basically, is exactly as it's designed to do. If you look at this graph, scientists call this the Great Acceleration. It shows the different dimensions of consumption and production that's done around the world. And you can see that ever since the sort of after the Second World War, there's been this explosion in this levels of production and consumption, leading to the devastation we're causing the rest of the earth. And conservative economists project that this is going to continue into the future. So they're looking out at around 2060, roughly tripling GDP from current production to that level. Well, how is that even possible, we might ask? And it really isn't. And scientists are telling us that we're rapidly heading for a precipice. A group of scientists led by Johan Rockström in Europe came up with this notion of what they call the safe operating space for humanity, looking at various, like 9 different planetary boundaries that we can't break through without getting out of that safe operating space. Well, the safe operating space is in the green. That orange shows how much we've broken out of those boundaries in so many different dimensions. And scientists are warning humanity. Thousands of scientists put out this warning, literally called it Warning to Humanity, a second notice saying soon it will be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory. Well, that was almost 10 years ago. Nothing has changed in our trajectory. Another Earth scientist, Hans Schellenhuber, says there's a very big risk we will end our civilization at this path. And UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls it collective suicide. So where are we headed? Well, one thing I think we can be pretty clear about is it's going to be one of the greatest transitions in human history that we experience this century. There's only been a couple of transitions like this since humans really emerged on Earth, when we went from hunter-gatherers to agriculture about 10,000 years ago. And when we went from agriculture to the scientific revolution with that European way of thinking about 400 years ago. And we're likely to experience this century a transformation every bit as vast that will change every aspect of the human experience. But what will that transformation actually look like? Well, there's actually 3 different scenarios. One is what people are increasingly concerned about, is just a total collapse of civilization, a loss of everything that has been developed over over hundreds and maybe even thousands of years. What a disastrous scenario. There's another scenario that I think many people in those techno elites think is probably more likely, and maybe we're headed towards that rather than a total collapse, which we might think of like as a techno split, or like a kind of a fortress Earth, where the very wealthy elite continue to enjoy their lifestyles and developing further technologies and AI and neurally enhancing themselves, while most of the rest of the world experiences some form of collapse. Also, from a moral standpoint, maybe an even more morally egregious scenario than total collapse. But then there's a third scenario, which would be to somehow find a way to stabilize where we're at as a civilization and actually move towards a more stable trajectory of truly sustainable flourishing. That's what I want to focus our attention on right now. And that's what increasingly people are calling the possibility of transitioning towards an ecological civilization. And what that would mean is basically changing essentially the operating system of our civilization, not just a few sort of technical fixes, but changing the operating system from capitalism, the way it is right now, to one that's based on an affirmation of life. So what is an ecological civilization? Basically that transformation in the basis of our global civilization from one that is wealth-based to one that is life-based. It's really looking at a global cultural and economic system that would promote sustainable flourishing for humans and the earth, with the overriding objective, basically, to create the conditions for all people to flourish as part of a thriving, living earth. And this is a vision not just coming from a few guys somewhere cloistered in some sort of smoky room somewhere, but it's an emerging vision from diverse sources all around the world, indigenous sources, like with concepts like Buen Vivir and Sumac Corsé in South America, and Ubuntu in Africa, from community-based sources like the Rights of Nature movement, permaculture, transition towns, theories of the commons, agroecology, spiritual sources like deep ecology, engaged Buddhism, ecological economics, and then political sources like the LGBTQ rights movement, traditional ecological knowledge applied from the indigenous sources, eco-socialism. All these are pointing to the same concept of an ecological civilization. And ultimately, we can get our understanding of what an ecological civilization would look like, taking our inspiration from nature itself, looking at ecology, looking at how living systems self-organize over time. And when we look at ecosystems, we find that they can remain resilient and strong for millions of years when left undisturbed by human activity. So I'm going to take a look right now with you at just some of those core principles of what an ecological system would look like that we learn from nature itself. Well, the first is to recognize that even though we're told this notion of selfishness in our dominant worldview, that humans are selfish, that nature is selfish, actually nature is not selfish. If we look back over those billions of years of life on Earth, there have only been a few basic jumps in the complexity of life since it began to complex cells, multicellular life, animals and mammals. And it turns out that every one of those great jumps in complexity came about not through increases in cooperation, but through in competition, but increases in cooperation, where different species learned to cooperate with each other to create something that was greater than the separate parts themselves. Essentially, life evolved through cooperation. Systems biologist Lynn Margulis basically said life didn't take over the world by combat, but by networking. And the primary secret life discovered was what's called mutually beneficial symbiosis, where each party gains from a reciprocal relationship, just like the honeybee and the flower there. And if we'd apply that to human society, that would lead to core principles of things like fairness, justice, equity, and individual dignity. Now, another principle of life is that nature is what's known as a holarchy, where each part is part of a greater whole. So just like cells are part of organisms, organisms are part of species, species are part of ecosystems, which are all part of the living earth. And from that recognition that each part is part of the greater whole comes this realization that in an ecosystem, and in a human ecological civilization, the health of the whole system requires the flourishing of each part, which is known as fractal flourishing. So life is not a zero-sum game, but when each different part of the system is healthy, it enables the system as a whole to become healthy. Well, another great principle from nature we learn is diversity. A system's health depends on basically differentiation and integration of all the parts in a greater whole. Now, in a human society, that would lead to the inherent right of each person and community to participate in cultural, political, and economic power. Another great principle from life itself is balance. In ecosystems, every part is in a harmonious relationship with the entire system. How would that translate to human society? Well, for starters, a steady state economy. And that economy would have equitable distribution of wealth and power. Something else we see in nature is what's known in human terms as subsidiarity, or like we can think of that as grassroots self-autonomy. Literally, like every blade of grass is not doing what it does based on what some higher power or hierarchy is telling it what to do. It's doing what it does based on its recognizing its own needs, based on its individual terrain that it's experiencing. So in an ecological civilization, one of the principles we would take from that is to push decision-making down to the lowest possible level in the system. And that's what's known as subsidiarity, as opposed to hierarchical decision-making. Then there's the concept of embeddedness, and really recognizing humanity as not being separate from, but being part of the natural world, which leads basically to tending Mother Earth rather than trying to control her. And then finally, there's this principle of regeneration. Ecologies regenerate themselves, which leads to sustainable flourishing into the long-term future. And here, where I'm calling from in North America, the Iroquois Confederacy centuries ago recognized this in their constitution, where they made this great statement you might have come across. In our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. And that's one of the principles of an ecological civilization. So what we're basically looking at is a transformation in values, emphasizing the quality of life rather than material possessions, basing our political, social, economic choices on our shared humanity with justice and dignity for all, building civilization's future on that basis of symbiosis with the living earth, where the flourishing of the natural world is a foundational principle. And these values relate a lot to, I mentioned Ubuntu before. In Africa, it's a fundamental concept of morality, which literally translates as I am because you are, a recognition that our identity comes from our shared human experience. And it's a life-based value system, ultimately, which is beautifully expressed by Albert Schweitzer back in the 20th century. He said in one epiphany, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And as a result, he said, I cannot but have reverence for all that is called life. That is the beginning and foundation of morality. So that's the underlying values of an ecological civilization. So I want to finish basically with just a glimpse of what that ecological civilization might look like in practice. So we'll go through just touch on some of these different dimensions of the entire thing. To understand is that we're not just talking about a change in economy, but a change in every aspect of our civilization. Well, to begin with, there would be a drastic reduction in this extreme global income inequality that we're experiencing right now. Part of that would be emphasizing worker-owned co-ops for business enterprises rather than corporations owned by shareholders. But when we turn to those corporations that basically dominate the world right now, we'd be looking at changing their charters so they existed for humanity rather than shareholder returns. Now, some of you might be familiar with what are known as benefit corporations or B corporations, which actually have changed their charters so they must consider the impact of all their decisions, not just on shareholders, but also on workers, customers, suppliers, community, environment. There are thousands of them around the world, but they've had so far no impact on where our world is heading because it's a voluntary choice and only a few small companies choose it, none of the big corporations. But imagine if there were what's known as a triple bottom line required for corporations to be allowed to have their charters, a triple bottom line of not just profit, but also people and planet, where those corporations could only get their charters renewed, say every 5 years, at the discretion, not of some regulator who basically then becomes the next chief executive the next year, but community-based panels chosen by sortition, just like jurors are chosen to reduce the risk of corruption. And all of a sudden, corporations could be subject not just to financial bankruptcy, but social or environmental bankruptcy if they didn't monitor all three of those bottom lines. But then going beyond corporations, there would be much greater emphasis on what's known as the commons, which you might have come across this concept. It's often talked about more historically, but we can think of the commons as any sorts of sustenance and well-being that has not yet been appropriated, either by the state or by private enterprise. And so that's all the different contributions from nature, like atmosphere, fresh water, sunshine, oceans, and our own human ancestral contributions to our wealth today, like language, cultural traditions, technology, and scientific knowledge. And if we think of what the commons is available to all of us. It's things like going back all the way in earliest time to the living earth, to what the earth produced, our own thousands of years ago, the cultural traditions that we inherited, more recent cultural traditions like writing, law, civilization. Then in just recent times, the last century or two, electricity, industrialization, global markets, and very recently, the last few decades, microprocessors, computer codes, and the internet. All that is really the commons, has been developed by our ancestors in the past. And then somebody comes along and takes all that stuff and does a few tweaks to it and maybe calls it Facebook. And all of a sudden, after those few tweaks, the person who came up with that one tiny little change suddenly has a net worth of roughly $100 billion. Is this maybe the greatest moral egregiousness in all of history, when he gets that net worth from adding just these tiny little touches to what's been created by all of our history, while half the world's population earn less each day than the minimum necessary for basic nutrition and a normal life expectancy. And so we can think of all that has been produced before the commons, basically like a common wealth, which is something that should be available and distributed to all of us, not just to the Mark Zuckerbergs. And there's a way to distribute that commonwealth, which has been shown to work and very effectively across the world. It's known as universal basic income. It basically is like an unconditional monthly payment to every adult, unconditional, sufficient to meet their basic needs, recognizing that purposeful work is an integral part of human flourishing. It's something people want to do because it's the fundamental need that we all have to feel valued by our community. And when universal basic income in experiments has been applied in programs across the world, and this map shows different places where it's been applied, what you see consistently is a reduction in all the things that we recognize are bad: crime, child mortality, malnutrition, truancy, teenage pregnancy, alcohol consumption. And you see an increase in what we recognize as welfare, health, gender equality, school performance, and even entrepreneurial activity. So that's one of the foundations of what an ecological civilization would be built on. Then looking at the economy as a whole, we'd be looking at shifting towards a circular economy, which increases employment while reducing waste, with products designed for repair and recycling, sourcing from recycled materials, waste virtually eliminated. Turning to our cities, we'd see them designed on ecological principles, community gardens on every block, extensive use of things like rooftop gardens, aquaponics. Cars would be banned from city centers, And wherever you lived in the city, essential services would always be within a 20-minute walk. So you'd have like local communities, local villages, basically, even within the city. Out of the city, in the countryside, we'd be looking at agroecology, replacing global industrial monocrops based on principles of permaculture, regenerative agriculture. It leads to greater crop biodiversity, water and carbon efficiency, eliminating synthetic fertilizer, eliminating factory farming. And it's been shown around the world that agroecology can be just as productive as industrial agriculture, but without all the devastating effects that we know of. Then we can turn to technology, and we can use technology not to empower just those few massive corporations, but to enable a global commons. And that would be done basically through an extensive use of what we call a distributed ledger, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. So moving from right now control and ownership of that information is centralized, which leads to this centralized power of companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, etc. But distributed ledger could lead to control being decentralized to protect collective action, enabling people to coordinate and cooperate at scale. And these experiments are being applied across the board in property law, money systems, DAOs, which many people might be familiar with, distributed autonomous organizations, distributed democracy, information ownership. When we measure our economy, we'd no longer be looking at gross domestic product, which basically just measures how quickly we're consuming the earth. But there are measures that have already been experimented with, like such as the genuine progress indicator, which factors in negatives like environmental pollution, crime, inequality, and positives that are currently ignored in GDP, like household work, volunteer work, or education. We'd be looking culturally, we'd be looking at shifting basically from the domination system we have right now, which is hierarchical, patriarchal based, subordinating women and femininity to men, and justifying and idealizing domination and violence, to what the great writer Rian Eisler calls the partnership system, more democratic and economically equitable structures, valuing female and as well as male stereotypes and values, mutual respect with trust, low degree of violence, and giving value to stories that emphasize empathic and caring relations. Then in global governance, looking at a more muscular form of the United Nations with enforcement powers over those global commons that we looked at, like the oceans, atmosphere, ecosystems. Maybe even a UN Rights of Nature declaration that puts the natural world on the same legal standing as humanity, with personhood being given to ecosystems, rivers, and high-functioning mammals, and the crime of ecocide as an international crime that executives and others could be brought to justice for. And overall, we'd be looking at building a planetary consciousness. It's like, we can think of like a hub and spoke network of what's called sometimes a cosmo-local connection. So we'd be focusing more on place-based identity, local community focus, more face-to-face interactions, citizen action networks, which would build trust and agency. But also we'd have a greater planetary consciousness where technologies like Facebook would be converted to the commons, and we could develop more of a sense of cosmopolitanism, a sense of global citizenship, so we can celebrate our diversity, even while we recognize our deep interdependence with all life around us. And ultimately, from a big picture, we'd be seeing humanity ultimately becoming what is potential for us, like pretty much like a connected superorganism, like a collective intelligence, where we as a species begin to see ourselves and the living earth as an integrated whole. And just to close with this sense of what's possible, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this term, the Anthropocene right now, this new age that archaeologists say we've entered from the Holocene. And it's this age that is based on this ideology of human supremacy, where human impact has reached geological proportions, which is what we've been talking about, destructive of life and biodiversity, and it's inherently unsustainable. Well, as we could transition to an ecological civilization, it leaves the potential for us to really move towards a different epoch in the Earth's history, to what some have started to call the Symbiocene, based on the principle of symbiosis, one of mutually beneficial flourishing of humans and the living Earth, where we'd still use technology, but for regenerative and life-affirming practices. And that epoch could be very long-lived. Potentially, we could become a civilization learning how to truly tend Mother Earth. So that's just to give you a glimpse of the vision, a glimpse of what's possible as you take everything you've been experiencing the last few days, go back out into the world, and how you can apply that towards the shared possibility. These are the books that I've written recently. Right now, I'm working on a book on an ecological civilization. And if you're interested in these ideas and sharing them with others, I invite you to go online and join thousands of us from around the world who are now part of this community, this network called the Deep Transformation Network. You see the URL there, deeptransformation.network. So I'd love to see you there. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And looks like we have maybe a few minutes for just some Q&A. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm gonna just show you the room and how excited we are.
Yeah.
Yes, you can clap again. Showing well.
Yeah. Great to see everybody.
Okay, I'm gonna turn this to myself. It was a marvelous presentation, and it's so beautiful because it's almost like an extension and a continuation of everything we have been experiencing in Heart Masters, and from opening speech of Mastering Today, our wisdom guide, to every speaker and panelist and the Socratic dialogues we have done today. It led to this moment of how you brought all of that together with your web of meaning. Thank you so much, Jeremy. We really appreciate.
Thank you.
With our remaining minutes, I would like to give the floor to our participants here. If there are any questions to Jeremy right here, right now. Okay, I'm giving.
Hello, Jeremy. This is
Hi.
Hi, nice to meet you. And thank you for a very inspiring talk. So obviously, coming from the business world, what you explained to us just now just sounds like a dream come true. I think everything you've said, I couldn't agree more. I guess my question is about the implementation of this, because, you know, in the day-to-day business world, these ideas are still not prevalent. You know, many people are still in the old kind of thinking. So how do you see this kind of gaining critical momentum and expediting, because it doesn't feel like we have a lot of time left to implement all of it? And what do you see as kind of catalysts for this change?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I'm so glad you asked that question. And well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, we do need to recognize that there are millions, tens of millions of people all around the world who have this sense of what's possible. And are working separately to try to make it happen. But part of what is possible once we begin to share a sense of that we're all moving together towards this shared potential vision is, it's like in systems, there's this way in which having an overriding principle can begin to infuse more power into the system itself. So the very sense that we're all working together can become what's known as a transformation catalyst. So it's almost like we're not looking about changing one aspect of the system, but changing almost like the amplitude of the system once we realize we're working together towards that shared possible future. And I think one thing we need to realize is the next years to come, things are getting worse. There's no question about it. And I don't want to give any sense of like sort of what's known as hopium to people, like, oh, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. Our civilization is collapsing. But if there is a potential for hope, what it is that as that system unravels, the potentiality for reweaving it gets to be greater and greater. Like we can imagine almost like a rug, that if it's tightly woven, you want to change its design, there's nothing you can do. But imagine the rug itself unraveling. Well, all of a sudden, if we've got enough people focusing on what's really possible, we can begin to reweave it from within. So what we ultimately have to do is just, we need to look at how bad things are, but rather than let that lead us to a sense of despair or just giving up or just reacting to things, it's like, let's focus on what one system's thinker once called islands of coherence in a sea of chaos. Focus on what's possible. Focus on doing it right with those values we talked about, but also on connecting that with others, not just focusing on your own little garden, but connecting these values and giving further amplitude to others in that system. And maybe from that sort of self-organized way, we can put enough amplitude in the system for this change to happen when the time comes. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for the questions, Zeynep. Anyone else? Curiosities? Okay.
Hi, a really great presentation, and there's a lot of recurring themes. I was kind of half writing a lyric inspired by some of your words and the speakers today, but I was really tuned in. And I've been hearing this theory of universal basic income and value-based systems where rather than GDP, we're looking at welfare. And this is also something that I can see I'm in the music industry, so it's something where I find it strange that we see artists value by streams instead of how healthy is this artist. We would still have Amy Winehouse, etc. All these things permeate through so many industries if we look at the welfare angle as our value of health. But what do you see as the actual transition to the people like us and the millions of people who do care, moving into something that does represent and actually live through that value system, as opposed to continuing on because we're so addicted to this system? How do you see those steps of actually transitioning, maybe in smaller groups, maybe in big groups, from what we are now to what we can be, potential of serving everything?
It's a great question. Thank you. And I do feel that we need to focus. You know, I was saying one of those principles I was talking about is like subsidiarity, putting power down to the local level. We really need to focus on building our local empowerment. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think I detected an English accent. But in the UK, there's this great group called the Alternative Global, who focus on what they call citizen action networks, where basically around the country, there's nothing stopping citizens from getting together, from actually creating their own autonomy, and not just listening to, like, trying to persuade the government to do something that we need or whatever, but actually creating it ourselves. Because if we wait for governments to change, that's never going to happen, because most government leaders are in the pockets of those same corporations and actually really just part of that same system. We have to build our own autonomy and really not compete with others who are doing that, but cooperate. So another of those key elements, as we build bring power down to our own local communities, if we feel something needs to be done, work together, make it happen. Try to relate to, sometimes people in local governments, like city governments, are not quite as separate from our systems as the national government. So we look for places to cooperate. Don't see the state necessarily the enemy, but try to focus on what's relevant is our own communities. And then, just as important, how do we collaborate with others working on similar things? So, and everything that we do, to focus as much attention not just on what we're doing and trying to make it successful, but look at others around us doing things similar and ask ourselves, how can we help that person to be successful too? And that's the way we can begin to build a different form of power from the grassroots all the way up to the system itself. Thank you for that. Yeah, perhaps we have time for maybe one more question at this point, and then.
Hi, Jeremy. Great talk.
Hi.
Thank you so much. My name is Ruben Daniels, and I work for a project called Memory. And we're building a regenerative AI platform. And I'm interested in hearing your take on how AI might help with building this new society that you envision.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're building a regenerative AI platform, because there's no question that AI is going to be one of the most important catalysts of change in years to come. Right now, we need to recognize that AI is being developed in that same corporate capitalist context. And as such, for all the good things people say about the potential of AI, we have to recognize that as it's produced in that kind of context, it is far likely to be, more than anything, just give more energy, more speed to those powers of consumption, those powers of manipulation of us as human beings that those corporations have become so adept at already. So I do feel AI is crucially important, but I think one of the most important things we need to do is basically to look at the foundational levels of AI and look at how we can establish the values of AI to really start from that basis of those values of an ecological civilization, like such as actual flourishing, human flourishing for all humans on a regenerated earth. Now, because a lot of people are looking at the possibility of real, a total transformation in AI in the next few years to come to some kind of general intelligence, maybe even like a singularity moment where AI can become so powerful that it can become more powerful than all of humanity. Well, until we can resolve this question basically of values, that is a terrifying scenario. So I just feel, and I'd be happy to explore more with you directly, whatever. I feel this is one of the most important things we can focus on right now, is look at how it might be possible to start AI from a foundation of life as a source of values and human flourishing on a regenerated earth as values, and then see where it might lead from there. So thank you for asking that.
Put it with you.
Cool, great. All right. Well, I'm looking at the time. Unfortunately, yeah, I'm gonna have to close. And I know you've got some, I think you got some whirling dervish activities coming up, which I'd love to be able to join you, but honestly, with my arm, I wouldn't be able to do too much, to be honest, myself. So.
Jeremy, thank you so much for this beautiful presentation and conversations. We invite you to Anatolia, to Turkey, as well as to Ibiza. When you recover, I hope we can connect soon and host you in person. Rudy, it's great to see you, and we miss you, and everybody here loves you both. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks to all of you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thanks, Jeremy. We'll be in touch. And there's some really interesting projects also of participants of Heart Masters. So we'll connect you to the ones that are interesting, okay?
That sounds great. Look forward to it. Thanks very much.
Let's keep moving. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Dear